of all, you pick the non-medical goal. Second of all, you're employing a non-medical means. Or third of all, even if the goal is medical and the means are medical, for some reason, the means end fit is not sufficiently tight. And we'll give you some examples of these, okay? So these are the three questions that you're going to ask yourself if you're asking yourself an internal morality of medicine question. Is a legitimate medical goal being pursued? Are the means being employed legitimate medical means? And then finally, are the goals and the means appropriately related? If they're not appropriately related, then you have a problem with the third category. So if you want to think about the entire universe of physician or physician assistant acts, we can say that there's two possibilities. Either a physician or PA employs legitimate and appropriate medical means in the pursuit of a legitimate medical end. Okay? Don't worry about the Latin stuff, okay? That's just, I'm not going to ask you about that, that's just there. And everybody's happy if the first conditions are met. The second possibility is that either the ends being pursued or the means being employed are not legitimate, or the means ends fit is not sufficiently tight. The means and the ends are not appropriately related. Okay? And then we would say that would run afoul of the internal morality of medicine. We'd say that the physician or physician assistant is engaged in something that falls outside the scope of proper medical practice. Okay? This, by the way, this term it just means beyond the powers. So let's talk about the three different categories of violating the internal morality of medicine. So here's the first one: goal illegitimacy. And this is, if anybody remembers, that is Jessica Rabbit. Yeah, Dr. Rabbit. So, and the case that I'm giving you here is a true case. This is an actual case. Goal illegitimacy means where the end or the goal of the act, although achievable, is not a legitimate medical goal. And so I would put forward as an example of that the actual case where a young woman of average height who wore a size 34C bra but wishes to undergo breast augmentation to a size 56 double F so that she can embark on a career as an exotic dancer. This was an actual case. And she actually found somebody who did that for her. Okay? Now I would argue that that's a violation of the internal morality of medicine, and it's a violation of the internal morality of medicine because the end, the goal, is not a legitimate medical goal.
Are you talking about the woman who lives over in like Miami?
I don't know where she
Made like $1 million.
I don't think she lives in Miami, but she slipped on the ice and ruptured the implants. So I don't think she lived in Miami.
Okay.
There was a TV show about a woman that did, I don't know if it was this
That was
specific
trying to
one.
be Barbie or something.
Like she was,
Oh.
That hot?
Yeah. There's a lady.
it was like on one of those TLC nonsense.
So does anybody?
But it's a lifestyle surgery, right?
It is. Yeah, it's a lot. Kind of hard to say it's an emergency. So I mean, does anybody want to argue that my position is incorrect and that this was a legitimate goal, legitimate medical goal? You have to then go back to the goals of medicine as formulated by the Hastings Center report. Another example, another real-life example, more recent, is the Jahi McMath case. Jahi McMath was the little girl, adolescent, who underwent, because she was having uveoplasty surgery in California. Something went wrong with the uveoplasty. She suffered a respiratory arrest and was brain dead. Right? She's brain dead now, brain dead. And the hospital tells the mother, we're really sorry, but she's brain dead. We're going to disconnect the ventilator because, we don't ventilate corpses. And the mother said no. No, and she went to court. And the court brokered some weird deal whereby the body of the child was released. The hospital fills out a death certificate, because the child was dead, according to the state of California. They released the body, still attached to the ventilator, to the mother, who found somebody, by the way, to put a tracheostomy in, to create a tracheostomy. And she flies her across the country to initially New York and then New Jersey, which has a statute that basically allows a religious exemption for people who don't believe in brain death. So in New Jersey, if you're brain dead, you're dead, unless you follow a religion that doesn't believe in brain death, then you're not dead, okay? So I would argue that whoever created that tracheostomy was engaged in a gold illegitimate act. This is a more interesting case in some ways. What?
Couldn't you argue
Sure.
that most cosmetic surgery has no legitimate medical goal?
Say that again?
Could you argue that cosmetic surgery in general really has no legitimate medical goal?
Yeah, that's of course where this goes, right? That's the next question that follows from this. Couple of things. Some surgery is reconstructive, so then that's not necessarily that wouldn't run afoul of the goals of medicine. You could make the argument. Remember how we defined a malady? Okay, you could make the argument. I'm not trying to be humorous here. That somebody is so ugly, they might have a deformity that it equates to a deformity, and that you're correcting a deformity. You could make that argument. Okay, but if you're talking about somebody who just, is perfectly normal looking, and they just, they want to be model looking, a cute nose and stuff like that, then I think there's real questions raised about the medical legitimacy of that. Now, it's easy for me to say because I don't earn a living doing it, but I think there's real questions that are raised by it. Yeah.
I'm just curious what you think about like medicine improving things, like improving like genetics or like just in general. Do you believe that medicine is only a
We are going to talk about. Yeah, we are going to talk about that, and ultimately, reasonable people disagree about that, right? About whether enhancement should be part of the practice of medicine, should be or not. Yeah.
That's exactly the direction I wanted to go. So really are trying to argue that cosmetic surgery
Is what? What's the question?
that cosmetic surgery is illegitimate.
Well, I didn't want to. I'm not looking to go that far. I'm just saying that I think that this is an example of something that has no legitimate goal.
So if it was on the 44,
I don't know. What do you think?
we're on a very gray water.
Let me ask you a question. Suppose it was 35. I mean, is 34C? Is anybody unhappy with 34C? Huh? I think instead of asking what's the number that you're trying to correct it to, you start with this number and say, is there a real problem with that number? So
I think it all comes down to psychological.
I was gonna say,
issues that
when does psychological come into play in this?
Oh, you mean
Because that
the-
could be a
the-
medical, how do you?
maybe
when
this
someone's doing
lady
position-
shouldn't have been allowed to consent to this surgery.
Yeah, or vice versa, if they do have plastic surgery, their psychological state improves, so. how does-
I don't think you can prove that.
I don't.
But again,
I'm just throwing,
so what goal are you're talking about treatment of pain and suffering?
how do we?
Well, where to go? You gotta go back to the goals. Prevention of premature death, right?
No.
Treatment of disease, cure of disease, treatment of pain and suffering,
No.
prevention of disease. It's gotta be pain and suffering. It's the only one that you could possibly get it in under. That she's got some type of she's suffering some type of psychological pain or suffering because she's living with only a 34C, right? That's the only way you can do it. That's the only way you can do it. The problem is you still need a malady, remember? Because it says pain and suffering caused by maladies. So what's her malady? You have to then say that having a 34C cup size is a malady, which means that a lot of people have the malady, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so then you have to fix everybody.
It's kind of like off topic, but at what point can you ever rule someone incompetent at some point for making a decision like this if they were really gung-ho on it? Like we were just talking about people who want to look like Justin Bieber and like do like crazy transformations.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things that are interesting about the case, and asking whether this lady, and I don't know to what extent they went to make sure that this lady had decisional capacity.
Okay.
She wanted to do it to make money, and supposedly she did make money, and in fact, she actually, what's interesting about this, another interesting footnote, she actually had the cost of the surgery, it was a tax write-off, because the cost of doing business. She was an exotic dancer, and she was able to write that off as a cost of doing business.
That's how the IRS works.
Okay, let's talk about the second category. The second category is means illegitimacy. Okay, this refers to those situations where the means being employed are not legitimate medical means. So this is not a real life example. It's a made-up example. A retired military officer with pain secondary to incurable metastatic cancer asks his physician to shoot him in order to put an end to his pain because, in the words of his hero, George S. Patton, there's only one proper way for a professional soldier to die, the last bullet of the last battle of the last war. Well, if you think about it, you can't argue with the goal, right? You agree with that? What do you think? You agree? What's the goal? What's the legitimate goal in this case? Yeah, there's a couple of goals. You can relief of pain and suffering caused by maladies, pursuit of a peaceful death. Okay, there's a couple of different ways that you can approach this. The problem is that this doesn't require any special medical knowledge or skill. Right? We don't generally learn anything about this in medical school or PA school. And so, since no special expertise is implicated, it's a non-medical means, and I would think that apart from the fact that you probably are prohibited by law from shooting somebody, just from the standpoint of the internal morality of medicine, you probably wouldn't be able to do it anyway. The third example is where you have the means-ends disconnect. Okay, so this is another case that is made up. You have a patient with a thin melanoma, so it's a superficial melanoma. The treatment is local excision. Okay, but he requests that his surgeon amputate his entire limb, quote, just to be sure. So this case, I think, illustrates pretty well why acceding to his wishes violates the internal morality of medicine. You shouldn't amputate his limb because it's the means and the ends they're not tight enough. They're too loose. Yeah, you'll get rid of the melanoma, but you could do much less extensive surgery and achieve the same goal. And so you have to do the much less extensive surgery. And remember that medical futility is the paradigmatic example of means-ends disconnect, which is complete, not just loosening, but complete disconnection between the means and the ends. Okay? Another recent example of, I think they didn't call it this, okay, but I think this was an example of means-ends disconnection, were the laws that have been introduced in the state of Florida regarding physicians counseling patients on firearms and documenting those conversations in the chart. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but this was a law that was passed. It was referred to as the famous Docs v. Blocks case. Okay, a healthcare practitioner who knows that such information, gun-related information, is not relevant to the patient's medical care or safety, or the safety of others, may not enter such information into the patient's medical record and should refrain from asking questions concerning the ownership of a firearm by the patient or the presence of a firearm in the domicile of the patient. So the legislature was concerned that patients who were gun owners were going to doctors and they were being asked, do you have a gun in the house? And some of these people took offense and they said, it's none of your business. I'm here for my hypertension, for my cough. And I'm not going to tell you. And so some of the doctors got pissed off and discharged the patients from their practices. Okay? And so they pressured the lawmakers, and the lawmakers came up with this statute. And ultimately, it went to court. This was the case, and it was decided that, again, it was referred to as the Dox versus Glocks case, and you can find the case at this site. And the court sided with the state of Florida, said, quote, we find that the act is a legitimate regulation of professional conduct. The act simply codifies that good medical care does not require inquiry or record keeping regarding firearms when unnecessary to a patient's care, and merely reaffirms the boundaries surrounding what constitutes good medical practice.
So, physicians went to the court
No.
after?
The gun owners went to, well, wait a minute, no, yes, the physicians took it to court because the law was enacted. The gun owners went to the legislators, and then the physicians went to court to challenge the law. They wanted the law struck down as a violation of free speech. And the court said this isn't speech, this is regulation of professional conduct.
Okay, and then who's on what side for governor of state of Florida versus?
State of Florida sided with the law. It was their law.
Okay, and Wolfslover
I guess it was one of the
Physicians.
plaintiffs, yeah.
What is constituted as unnecessary for patient care? Based on that?
You have the opinion there, so if you want to take a look at the whole thing, but I'll give you an example of something that wouldn't be unnecessary. So for example, if somebody is suicidal or expresses suicidal ideation, then it would be appropriate to ask about the presence of a firearm in the house, okay?
They would be covered under this ruling?
Yeah, this doesn't interfere with that, okay? The court is concerned about fishing expeditions that people, how in the old days we didn't used to ask a whole bunch of questions that medical students and PA students get trained to ask now, like, do you wear your seatbelt? Do you exercise regularly? Do you have a firearm in the house? Well, they didn't want that fishing expedition. So that's what they were talking about. Okay, so that's the end of the internal morality of medicine. Does anybody have any questions about the internal morality of medicine? Any of the topics that we talked about today? We're going to turn our attention to professionalism now. If we don't finish it by the end of the hour, then we'll finish it at the beginning of the next session. Okay, so professionalism, remember I told you that professionalism is professionalism and the internal morality of medicine are basically two sides of the same coin. And you can think about professionalism, for lack of a better way to think about it, as sort of we talked about the virtues. So professionalism is sort of related to the virtues. If the internal morality of medicine reminds you more of rules and principles, and professionalism should remind you of virtue ethics. Okay? And this is a quote from Aristotle. Excellence is an art won by training and habituation. We do not act rightly because we have virtue or excellence, but rather we have those because we have acted rightly. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit. Let's talk, in order to talk about professionalism, you have to talk about professionals. And to talk about professionals, you have to talk about professions. So let's talk about professions. A profession is defined as a vocation or an occupation requiring special, usually advanced education, knowledge, and skill. And as you'll see, there are certain characteristics or features of professions. The term originally was applied to 3 areas. It was applied to divinity, to law, and to medicine, right? But now everybody calls themselves a professional, right? Even football players are real professional. So the term has sort of gotten watered down, okay? But originally it only applied to these 3 areas. Let's talk, I'm going to skip over, this is some of the things that patients, when you ask a patient what does professionalism mean, these are some of the things that they'll tell you, okay? But don't worry about that, what they tell you. You can revisit that after we talk about what professionalism actually is. These are some of the things that professionalism is not, according to Pellegrino, Dr. Pellegrino. Professionalism is not unquestioned loyalty to other members of the same profession. It's not about exclusivity and elitism. It's not about a concern for a title or a union mentality. It's not about medical political action committees. It's not supposed to be about that. So what is it? What are the characteristics or the features of professionalism? And I'm going to suggest that professionalism is characterized by these, or professions are characterized by these 5 features. And we're going to talk about each of these in turn. These characterize professions. Let's talk first about authority. And remember that the first feature is authority, but it's a specific type of authority. It's expert authority, okay? So let's talk first about authority in general, and then we'll talk about expert authority. Authority was defined by Weber as the probability that one's commands will be obeyed. So to the extent that my commands are likely to be obeyed, then one can say that I have authority. It refers to recognition by those who are asked to obey that they should obey, and they don't employ coercion or persuasion. So the authority figure doesn't have to coerce you into doing what he or she wants you to do, and doesn't have to persuade you. That's not what authority is. For example, it is, take for example the judicial branch, which is a source of legal authority, right? Well, they don't have any power. They can't really coerce you to do anything. They can use the other arms of the government that can coerce you, but the court can't enforce their own edict. Say it again?
That sounds like coercion to me, because if you don't do it,
Well, they again, there was a famous, which case it was, but it was John Marshall was the Chief Justice. He made a decision, and Thomas Jefferson was the president, I think it was Thomas Jefferson, and he didn't like the decision, and so they said, Mr. President, he goes, John Marshall's made his decision, let him enforce it now. In other words, I'm not going to enforce it. So, in general, the traditional view is that of course courts can hold you in contempt, and they can jail you and stuff like that. But think for example about the Supreme Court, right, when they decided the Bush v. Gore case. There really wasn't anything that they could do. Suppose Gore said, "Look, I don't care what you say. I still think I won." What's the Supreme Court going to do? They can't do it, right? Also, authority is distinct from persuasion. Okay, so think about when a child asks, their parent, well, why do I have to do that? You don't usually do it because it's a losing proposition. You don't usually try to convince them that you're of the rightness of your position. Usually, parents just say you have to do it because I said so. So in the medical context, the physician cannot force me to take my medicine, coercion, and he does not need to persuade me to do so. Usually, the patient takes the medicine because the person believes that the physician knows something about medicine that they don't know. They have expert authority. So that's the type of authority that physicians and physician assistants employ and depend on. Now, there are other types of authority as well, as you see on the slide, okay? But for the purposes of professionalism and medical professionalism, the type of authority that's at stake, that's invoked, is expert authority. Sometimes, by the way, we make use of other types of authority. So you may be a provider who is particularly charismatic, and patients may be moved in part, not just by knowledge, their belief that you know something that they don't, but also because of your charisma. So that's an option, that's a possibility as well. Okay, the second feature of professions is that professionals act as intermediaries between individuals and society, between clients or patients and society. So that can work in two different ways. Sometimes the provider, the professional, creates a safety zone for the individual against demands of social norms. So for example, a patient comes to me and says, you know, I'm sick, I'm supposed to work today, I can't work. You examine them, you agree that they're sick, you write them a sick note. They're excused from the societal norm that demands that you are work, okay? Also, if somebody is arrested and they're going to be tried, they're arrested for murder, and you're a psychiatrist and you go to see the patient and you say this person is crazy, this person's out of their mind, okay? Then that person is not going to be punished by society, right? They may be institutionalized, right? They may be subjected to psychiatric evaluation and treatment, but they're not going to be put on trial and then executed or what have you. Okay, so you're creating a safety zone for that person. The flip side of the coin is that sometimes the provider is asked, the professional is asked to curb the individual's deviance for the betterment of society. So for example, if the person comes to you for a sick note and they're not sick, well then they don't deserve a note. Or I'll give you an everyday thing, this happens all the time in practice. Person comes to you for a handicapped parking permit. I bet that we give out more handicapped parking permits than there are handicapped people in the United States, right? Because what happens is that people are afraid, providers are afraid of losing the patient. It's like, well, what is it to me? You know? I don't care. I give him the handicap permit. But from the standpoint of the professional, the stronger course of action would be to say, you know, I really can't do that for you. You don't need a handicap. Let me do the testing on you, and you seem perfectly capable of walking to your car. I think I can in good conscience give you this. Sometimes it's hard to do the right thing. Any questions about the first two? Okay, the third feature of professions is that ideally professionals, their motivations are different than the things that motivate non-professionals. So the interests of the professionals ideally are in status and reputation rather than in political power and wealth. The fact that the professional is not or should not be interested in or motivated by pecuniary gain helps guarantee or should help guarantee that they can't be captured by moneyed interests. Okay? Now I understand this isn't the way, if you look at medicine in 2015 in the United States, and you look at the parking lot at the hospital and the doctor's parking lot, it just doesn't seem that something seems wrong, something seems amiss here. But ideally, they aren't supposed to be motivated. Again, Weber and is not saying that that's the way it is. He's saying that's the way it should be ideally. Okay, that they shouldn't be motivated by pecuniary interest, because that could allow them to be captured by private moneyed interests. Likewise, if they're interested in capturing political power, that allows them to be captured by swayed by political interest and captured by political entities. So ideally, the professional is independent of both the private moneyed interests and the political interests. So what is appropriate motivation for professionals? Well, again, status and reputation. So they would argue, Parsons would argue, well, it's perfectly okay for doctors to compete with each other to have the reputation as like the best doctor, he's the best surgeon in town. This is the best diagnostician in town. He's the best technically at what he does. It's okay for them to compete with each other for example, publication in the medical literature. On a lower level, you see this in PA school, you see it in medical school, you see it in internship and residency, as the different trainees compete with each other, you know, at grand rounds, at the morning report, you know, cases are presented and people are asked for their opinion, and you'll see it's very competitive. People try to make sense of the case, and they try to be the one that's the most astute. Okay, so and Parsons argues that that's perfectly okay. You don't have to want to be Mother Teresa to be a good doctor. Okay, it's okay. It's okay if you're motivated by an interest in professional status and professional reputation. Okay. The fourth feature of professions is that professions are self-regulating. And this is true both at the individual level and also at the level of the profession as a whole. So, for example, it's up to the individual practitioner to make sure that he or she stays up to date with, stays current in terms of his medical knowledge and skills. Okay? And most of the time, it's up to us to make sure that we do the right thing with regard to any particular patient. Okay? It's usually not somebody looking over our shoulders. So, professionalism, it entails self-regulation. On a greater level, on a macro level, the profession is supposed to be self-regulating. So that's why you have, well, we don't do a good job of it. Well, that's why we have boards of medicine that are supposed to punish, identify people who are violating the tenets of professionalism, who are behaving badly, and punish them appropriately. Again, we don't do a really good job about that. We also have committees in the hospital, peer review committees. That's part of the whole idea of self-regulation. So peer review committees in the hospital, boards of medicine at the state level. All of those things are examples of self-regulation. And these are some examples of issues that are supposed to be attended to as part of self-regulation. Maintaining excellence in training, securing social status and recognition for physicians, fostering competition, policing physicians by means of peer review. We already mentioned that. Parsons and others have argued that these, on the other hand, are activities that are not appropriate for professionals or professions. Lobbying for pocketbook issues, this happens all the time. Training physicians to concentrate on money. You know, it's really sad is that they're ready to roll out ICD-10 in a couple of days. And the amount of effort that is going to go into dealing with that, one wonders how it's going to be a huge hit in terms of efficiency, and I wonder what the benefit's going to be. Moran has argued about the importance of maintaining independence of judgment and clinical autonomy when we enter into contracts, so that we don't give up our autonomy on the front end. Don't put ourselves in a position where it's going to be difficult to maintain professionalism later on. So this is from her article. Physicians themselves must shoulder some major responsibility if they are to preserve a measure of the clinical independence needed for serving their patients well. Perhaps at the top of the list, they must now learn to scrutinize contracts, or more realistically, to hire knowledgeable people to do it on their behalf, and refuse to sign on to arrangements that they find ethically, financially, or medically intolerable. So, sometimes what she's suggesting is that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And if you put yourself into a situation where you're going to be likely, or your ability to behave professionally is going to be taxed or stressed, then maybe that's not an arrangement that you should agree to. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. Take a job with a tremendous salary, really high salary, and then you find out, before you sign the contract, you find out that, okay, yeah, you're getting a tremendous salary, you're getting $250,000 a year, oh, but you have to see 40 patients a day, 30 patients a day. Well, okay, can you do a good job seeing 30 or 40 patients? Let's say you're a hospital. Can you do a good job seeing 30 or 40 hospitals? Forget about it. It'll drive you crazy in short order. But apart from that, can you do right by those patients? That's a lot of patients. That's a lot of patients. So the question is should you agree to something like that? You put yourself in a situation where, on the front end, where the ethics just don't seem right. Another example, there are situations where sometimes insurance companies will delegate the risk and will delegate the risk and the medical decision making to individual practitioners. If the practitioner has a big practice or something like that, I'll tell you what I mean by that. So normally, if you're a provider, you're going to get paid either fee for service, or maybe you're capitated, right? If it's managed care, you might be capitated, where you get paid a certain amount for every patient in your practice, and but the risk is on the insurance company. Well, sometimes what happens is that the insurance company will say, okay, you, Dr. Smith, we're going to give you responsibility for these 1,000 patients, okay? We'll give you 95% of the premiums that they're paying. Tremendous amount of money, or 90% or 95%. They keep something for administrative purposes. We'll give you all the money, okay? You need to take care of these patients. If something goes wrong, and the patient needs to be taken care of, that has to come out of the money we're paying you, right? Because that's what insurance companies do, right? So the risk is being passed on to the practitioner. Well, you'll see cases, I've seen cases where the practitioners are so corrupted by that arrangement that they will actually try to talk the patient out of appropriate medical treatment because it's too expensive. So a patient, for example, that came in with angina, had, I think, 3-vessel disease. Well, the standard of care, coronary artery bypass grafting surgery. Now, the guy was, I don't know, 70 years old or something. He was a little bit elderly, but that 70's nothing, And the provider's like, well, he goes to the hospital to talk to the patient, says, listen, I know the surgeon was here, the cardiologist was here talking to you about CABG. That's madness at your age, or you shouldn't do it. Trying to talk the patient out of, the standard treatment, because he didn't want to put himself at financial risk. So, that's one of the things that she's alluding to there. Okay, the last feature of professions is that professionals make acts of profession. They take oaths. So a profession, again, means to declare something aloud, publicly, usually. It's a promise or a commitment. The profession of professionals is fundamentally speaking forth in public before the world and before one's fellow professionals. It's a public commitment to obeying socially accepted standards of both morality and of competence in one's work. And it's been suggested that we actually make these professionals make these professions in public, okay, but also we make them in private, okay? So what the public professions, for example, is the profession that you make, well, the profession, for example, that you make, for example, at certain ceremonies, like a white coat ceremony. Does anybody remember what you swore to, by the way, at that ceremony? I don't. Well, I didn't take the oath. But one of the things you'll notice about modern oaths is that it's like watching a political debate, right? You ask them a question, and they don't answer the question. They just talk about something else. And that's the nature of modern oaths, right? There's no commitment to do this or not do this, right? They're just kind of like, oh. It's hard to think of something that you can't do, even taking the oath that you took. In any event, you may take the oath again when you graduate, I'm not sure. Maybe you take a different oath. According to Pellegrino, without the oath, the doctor is a skilled technician or a laborer whose knowledge fits him for an occupation, but not a profession. Now, some people might suggest that just by virtue of the fact that you are going to PA school or medical school, you're taking an implied oath. It almost doesn't matter whether you, suppose you're sick the day they take the oath, right? Suppose you're sick the day they read the oath. Or suppose they get Joanne to write the oath, okay? Or one of the housekeeping people to write the oath, and that's the oath you take, okay? Does that really affect the nature of the promise that you, the compact that you've made with the public? It can't be, right? So some people would suggest that there's an implied oath just by virtue of the fact that you've embarked on this training. The second way that you make professions, public professions, is whenever organizations that we belong to promulgate codes of ethics. Okay, so AAPA promulgates a code of ethics. That's a profession, a public profession that you're making as a member. Okay, this is the Hippocratic Oath. Okay. Again, the Hippocratic Oath, I think it's a very, 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 very tiny minority of schools that take this oath anymore. But you see that this actually was pretty clear on what you could and couldn't do. The duty of beneficence and non-maleficence, prohibition of physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia, prohibition of sexual relations with patients, prohibition of abortion, demands of confidentiality. A couple of years ago, more than a couple of years ago now, but the American College of Physicians and the American Society of Internal Medicine and the European counterparts released this charter on medical professionalism. This was another example. You don't need to memorize this stuff. This was another example of a code of ethics that was released relatively recently. Okay? It's just another example of that, of the promulgation of a code of ethics by organizations, and that constituted the taking of an oath, if you will. And then the second way that we make acts of profession is in private with our patients. So according to Pellegrino, quote, every time a physician sees a patient and asks, what can I do for you? What's wrong? What is the problem? He or she is professing two things. One is competence, and the other is to use that competence in the best interests of the patient. So the profession that we make in private and in public invites trust and incurs moral obligations. what's the obligation that it incurs? It incurs the obligation to make ourselves into the practitioners that are deserving of that trust. So when somebody talks about professionalism, and hey, that's unprofessional, the question is, well, what's the relationship? Because I think a lot of people misdefine professionalism. You know, they think it's got something to do with ceremony and stuff like that. But the question is, what's the relationship between what they are citing as a behavior that is, let's say, inconsistent with professionalism, and the effect it's going to have on patients trusting us? Okay. Physician assistants should aspire to make themselves into the kinds of people who will be trusted and trustworthy. Again, we saw this before when we talked about virtue-based ethics. Concentrate on the agents instead of on the action. And some of the virtues that have been cited as being important in the practice of medicine, okay, include fidelity, benevolence, intellectual honesty, courage. Remember, courage is not a moral virtue. Moral courage is a moral virtue, but courage is a personal virtue, not a moral virtue. Compassion, truthfulness. Truthfulness is a moral virtue. And then, just in summary, professionalism requires physicians to be knowledgeable and skilled, and to continuously update their expertise and proficiency. So there's the competency portion of it. Professionalism, because if you don't have that, you don't have any claim to expert authority, right? Professionalism demands that physicians suppress self-interest in the service of the well-being of their patients. Professionalism entails that physicians make themselves into the kinds of people who will be trusted by society and who will be worthy of that trust. And it demands that the institutions of medicine be designed to promote society's trust and not to undermine it. That's important, okay? They're talking about systematic assaults on professionalism. If anybody's interested, I don't know if I assigned this, but I might assign it. I probably will. Okay, I'll probably post it. This is because I try to get some newer stuff in, and this is relatively new. This was an approach to a different way of looking at medical professionalism. So maybe I'll post that. And then in terms of some professionals that, icons of professionalism, did anybody see the movie Beckett? Okay, so remember I said divinity, law, and medicine, okay? So this was an example of Beckett, who at peril to himself and ultimately at the cost of his own life, did the right thing, okay, and defied the king. So Thomas More in A Man for All Seasons, who also, this is More defying King Henry VIII. Henry VIII wants him to say it's okay. He wants him to say it's okay for him to divorce his first wife and marry his second wife. And of course, he can't do that in good conscience. Okay? Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird. Okay, so again, a consummate example of legal professionalism. A lot of people went to law school because of Atticus, the character Atticus Finch, and there was a book written in search of Atticus Finch. I just had nothing better to do, so I looked up to see if there were any saints who were positioned. There's a list of them, for what it's worth. And then I showed you guys Dr. Ferrero, right?
Yeah.
Dr. Ferrero?
Yeah.
Okay, so there's Dr. Ferrero, which is the medical example of that I have of professionals. Okay, anybody have any questions? Anybody have any questions about anything we talked about today? It's a long 4 hours.
The tortured, the labyrinth, yeah.
All right, thanks for listening.
Thank you.
I didn't know what it was by calling it introductory.